Welcome to the Stephen Mansfield audio podcast.
I want to bring us finally to the last in our series about race, the last podcast in our series about race. We've talked about all kinds of things related to race in this four-part series, attitudes, cultures. We've talked about film. We've talked about the surprising kind of stupid racism that's alive in our society right now, as opposed to at least a faux science kind of racism that seemed to be supported in the 1800s. We've just discussed every kind of thing, and I want to reflect a little bit on some of the feedback I've been getting from those of you who have been listening. I've been traveling in the Carolinas here lately, up in Washington, D.C., and I've had a number of African Americans come and express gratitude for the podcast and things that we've said, and essentially say, you know, we're trying to get over wounds. We're trying to understand a different approach to white society, and it was just helpful to have a white guy talk about these things. That was gratifying to me. I was glad for that. But the things that touched me most were where people have either written in or walked up to me where they knew me, on airport or wherever, and said, listen, I battle some serious racism. And I didn't fully realize it until I listened to your podcast and understood what racism is, and understood how associating a skin color with a certain culture, maybe an inferior culture in the sense that it's violent or drug-ridden or something of that nature, that to do that is a form of racism, as though to assume that all who are shooting people in the inner cities are black-skinned or things of that nature. And it really has been touching to listen to people, again, standing right in the middle of a terminal at an airport, cry about the kinds of conversations that their families had at the dinner table, about the attitudes that their parents impressed upon the kids, about the way that became sort of a heat-seeking missile, in the sense that once they had their attitudes towards, say, blacks or Asians or Hispanics turned a certain way, all their experience through life seemed to confirm these bigoted opinions. And it's hurt them in their jobs. Some of them had even been reprimanded in the military for it. One guy had actually lost his job because he had been joking about African Americans, and it hadn't gone well. It was against company policy, and he got fired. So it's been a very, very rewarding experience on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's been touching and somewhat disturbing that people are still dealing with such astonishing attitudes. You know, Bev and I woke up this morning, turned on the television, and heard reports on MSNBC about how women still don't make equal pay with men. And we're fairly informed human beings. We turned and looked at each other and said, we thought this was solved. We thought this was done. I mean, we didn't know it was even legal to pay a woman something different from a man for the same work. Well, the same thing is true when it comes to racism. I am completely stunned that we have come back to this state in our society, given the civil rights movement, given the battles coming out of the Civil War, given some of the wonderfully articulate leaders in the matters of race, and even from other countries like Nelson Mandela. It's astonishing to me that we are back in this sort of racial tension that we seem to be discussing all the time. The thing that touched me the most, and the thing I want to answer for the rest of this podcast, was when people would ask me, what do I do to change these attitudes? One family, for example, said, yes, our parents, my kids' grandparents, are racist. They really don't like anybody who's not of white skin. They talk about it all the time. They think the decline of America is related to an influx of immigrants and people of non-white skin color, all of that kind of racist attitude. We've absorbed some of it. We're working against it. This is the husband and wife speaking. What do we do? What are the things that we can do to make a difference? And I think that there are a number of steps, and I'm going to mention them. Some of them are obvious, some of them less obvious. But I think that one of the most important things we can do, and it's not the only thing we can do. In fact, if we only do this, I think we're going to have some myths and some misunderstandings, some out of proportion sort of perspectives on any given people group. But obviously, the most accessible way to begin to get somehow, in some way, in touch with your own racism and begin to see other races in a positive way is to read a bit. Read the literature, and don't just read pop literature. Don't just read, the luscious breath novels, as I call them, romance novels, written by a black woman or something. Read the literature about the great books that are about a given people. I remember once when I was talking to some young Asian women who were actually friends of mine, and I said, look, I know a little bit about African American literature. I don't know much about Asian American literature. What should I read? And before it was even a movie, there was a book called The Joy Luck Club, and they said, this has got its stereotypes like all literature, but it's the closest thing that we have. Would you read this and interact with us about it? And I did, and I'm certainly no expert on Asian American women, but it was through the lens of this book and a woman chronicling the experience of her family that I came to understand what I wouldn't have understood any other way. Being a white male, Anglo, I would not have understood the experience of Asian women in America. It's very, very, very helpful. The same thing's true in African American literature. The same thing's true in Native American literature. We perhaps can put up on a later podcast or somewhere on our site a list of recommended books. But there's wonderful literature that you can invest in. There's been some wonderful Hispanic literature of late, chronicling the Hispanic experience in America. And so I recommend investing in the literature. I don't want to see people only do that because I think that's a little bit academic, a little bit intellectual, but it could be a starting place, at least to understand the experience. Of course, you know that I believe that movies help. They need to be good movies, and we need to remember that people aren't locked into some of these stereotypes or some of these time periods. For example, you can't watch The Color Purple and think you're going to understand the guys that you're going to school with. I mean, that's crazy. It's 100 years gap in that story, and while it will help, it'll give some background. It'll help perhaps a white person understand the thought forms and the memories, cultural memory of an African American in this country today. That alone is not going to get us where we need to go, but it does help. It absolutely does help. I think, too, that there are some wonderful documentaries being made by PBS. Recently, there was a fine 5-part series on Hispanic Americans, shot by and produced by Hispanic Americans. It was perhaps the finest piece on a people group in America I've ever seen. So you want to be sure and check that out. But I don't want books, movies, television to be the way that you interact with a people group actually walking the streets. The best way to begin to pull down the stereotypes that perhaps have bedeviled your family is to actually, in a minor way, I'm going to use a major phrase for a relatively minor thing, cross the color line. Consider, if your problem is African Americans, going to an African American church. Consider befriending those who are in your neighborhood. Consider having a dinner. Consider putting yourself in a position where you're actually interacting. I spend a great deal of time in the African American community, and I'm astonished by the myths that still prevail. It's like something out of the Middle Ages or the more mythological earlier periods of American history. It's astonishing what people will think. I'm going to risk being insulting for a moment, but I had a conversation with a high-ranking Army officer who was still convinced that blacks were better athletes because they had different muscles from whites, which is, of course, a complete myth. But it's the kind of thing that grew out of slavery and the use of African Americans as slaves and as engines of economic development and so on. I think the point is that these myths come down as we interact. And so part of the question I'd have, I'm thinking of the young couple with 2 kids who were decrying their racist family background. I mean, do you know any black people? Do you spend time with any black people? Do you put yourself in a position where you can know black people? What is it that you do to sort of interact? This is a lot of the problem. In our modern society, we live in little isolated cloisters, like so many icebergs on an icy sea, and we don't interact very much. And I urge you, in our society, it just does not have to be a problem. It just does not have to be a problem. So get into a church. Spend time with some Sikhs. I talked to some people this past week who have a very difficult time with Sikhs. As we know, there are people who have struggled with anti-Semitism, and this comes from all sorts of directions. Most of those who came to me on this issue were African Americans who believe certain myths and sort of the way our politics aligns, where often, for example, in New York, it's black interests versus Jewish interests. And of course, much of this is a myth, but this is how it's played out in their experience. I can't urge enough that you cross lines, that you spend time with people representative of any given people group you have a problem with, that you build relationships, that you open your home, and that you begin to stop treating people as though they're, under a microscope. And I think that one of the things that will make a big difference, too, I always teach people that when they're trying to forgive, they should find the hook of compassion, meaning if I'm angry at my father because maybe he wasn't a great father, can I look over his life and find something that I can have compassion for? Maybe he wasn't fathered well, or maybe he had some deformity in his life that he couldn't get on top of, and then maybe he wasn't the best father for me. If I can figure out some way to believe something other than he just evil or didn't love me, or if I can just try to get into his soul a little bit and understand, it makes a difference. Well, I would recommend you do the same thing now. For example, young black men are some of the most troubled people in our society. If you're looking at drug addiction rates, you're looking at arrest rates, you're looking at prison, etc. But I strongly urge you to read the writings of Joshua Du Bois. I strongly urge you to read some of the really trenchant articles that have been in Newsweek and Time recently about young black men. I strongly urge you to try to find the hook of compassion about the people that maybe you are having difficulty with, you believe some myths about, you had some racism toward embedded in your soul. What is the experience of a young black man? What is the typical inner city African-American family? Again, if this is the issue. What is your perspective on this, and what is it you don't know about what they're experiencing? We can all go around tisking about what's going on with young black men in the south side of Chicago, but do we have any sense of their economic condition? Do we have any sense of the breakdown of the family? Do we have any sense of how poor the schools are there? Do we have any sense of how their well-being is often a political football and never really fully addressed? And then I want to say, too, just as a final thought, that for some of you, some of the ones who came up to speak to me, were people who, their problem were not some of the traditional ones, Jewish, black, white, black, but they were troubled by the Asian infusion in the last decades, and troubled that their kids didn't rank as highly in academic performance and felt like Asian Americans were getting preferential treatment. This, of course, doesn't stand up to the analysis, the statistics. It's not a matter of preferential treatment. It's a different culture. What's the culture in Asian society, in Asian family structure, that produces these smart, brilliant kids? And what's the difference between, let's say, the typical white suburban culture and what it produces of their children? Whenever you start speaking about race, whenever you start looking at skin color, whenever you try to look at racial politics and racial cultural issues, people squirm. They get uncomfortable. It's not something that we're used to. We're as clumsy talking about race as we are talking about religion. But I was moved by how just my few little thoughts, couldn't have been more than 30 minutes because it was 3 podcasts at 10 minutes, moved people to write me and say, help me break out of this. What do I do? And so you hear it from me. Pray, read, try to understand. Get the hook of compassion, understand the good, the redemptive good about a people group, and then get out of your home and have real life experience. Get into the middle of it. Get into the church. Go to the temple. Talk to the person. Interview people. Find out what's going on. Don't live in an isolation that just breeds misunderstanding and the kind of absolutely stupid racism that we're dealing with in our society now.
Stephen Mansfield is a New York Times best-selling author and popular speaker who coaches and advises leaders worldwide. To learn more about Stephen, log on to stephenmansfield.tv. The Stephen Mansfield podcast is produced by Isaac Darnell, who also wrote and performed the Rockin' Podcast theme song. This is a Chartwell Literary Group production. Chartwell is ingeniously led by Beverly Darnell Mansfield. As a result, all rights are reserved. For more information, contact us through stephenmansfield.tv.